I've recorded my podcast. Now, what do I do with it? Where should I put it so listeners can actually discover and listen to it? Hello, friend. Thanks for pressing play on this episode of the Brassy Broadcast. I'm Jen Eads. I'm a musician, a student of the creative universe, and a curious girl full of questions. I'm also the head broad in charge at the Brassy Broadcasting Company, where I get to partner with the creators, the doers, and the makers of this world to put them in the ears, heads, and hearts of new audiences with podcasts and other audio goodness. If you're feeling inspired to learn more about podcasting after listening to this episode, check out the Brassy Broad's Brass Tacks podcasting course. It's your free introductory podcast course, and you can find it at brassybroad.com. And if you have any questions about anything discussed in this episode, you can always email me directly at jen, at brassybroad.com. Now let's get into it. I'm often asked, where should I put my podcast so people can find it? My answer is as many places as possible, so it's easy for people to discover it. In addition to producing your podcast, you have to make sure it's available and easy for listeners to access on a variety of platforms. Many new podcasters get wrapped up in getting their show on iTunes. iTunes is only one of many places you need to have your podcast. Friends, here is my list of top 6 places you need to have your podcast. Let's start with the big one, Apple Podcasts, formerly iTunes. Apple has rebranded iTunes as Apple Podcasts, and it's incredibly easy to send links and tell people that they can find you in Apple Podcasts. You're going to need to have an iTunes account to submit your RSS feed to Apple Podcasts, and podcasts are submitted through iTunes Connect. Okay, great. So you've got yourself set up on Apple Podcast. Now, how do you make your show available to the rest of the world that doesn't have an iPhone or an iPad or just doesn't like the Apple Podcast app? Because honestly, friends, that app could use some work. It is not one of my favorites for listening to podcasts. Lucky for us, there are a number of alternatives. Stitcher Radio is an app that is available for both iOS and Android, and it's free to download. And it's easy to submit your podcast to Stitcher through their partner portal. Google Play Music is another app for Android users. Don't assume that everyone listening to podcasts is listening on an iPhone or iPad. You've got to share your podcast awesomeness across a variety of platforms. So make sure that you are submitted to Google Play Music for your Android listeners. And YouTube. Yes, you can put audio-only podcasts on YouTube. Because we often only associate YouTube with video content, podcasters overlook YouTube. It's in my list for top places you need to be for good reason. It's the second largest search engine out there. People go to YouTube when they want to learn how to do something or how to do something better. If you help people learn how to do something or do something better, you are leaving listens on the table if you're not on YouTube. Help listeners discover your show on YouTube by having your podcast there, and then give them the opportunity to take you with them by telling them how they can subscribe to your podcast so they don't have to just sit and watch a still image to listen to your show. Stay tuned for a future episode on how to optimize your YouTube page. Another app that's available for iOS and Android is TuneIn Radio. TuneIn brings together all the sports, music, news, podcasts, and audiobooks you love. Original, live, and on-demand internet radio all in one place. So yes, you want to be there. People are tuning in to TuneIn Radio, so that is another place you want to be. And lastly, if you have a website, your podcast should be on it if it's related to what your website is about. And here's a pro tip. Don't just put a link to how they can find it on Apple Podcast, formerly iTunes. You don't want to alienate the non-Apple Podcast users that want to check out your show. Make episodes available that can be played right there on your website. There are a number of podcast players available that look great. I keep it super simple on my own website at brassybroad.com. I post episodes and set them up just like blog posts. I host my podcast with Libsyn. And just a little side note, if you're looking for podcast hosting, I've been super happy with Libsyn. Check them out at libsyn.com. And if you use code word Brassy, Brassy, you're going to get your first month of hosting for free. I love their podcast player. I just copy the code from my episode in their player and paste it to my blog post. Super easy peasy. You can see what that looks like at brassybroad.com/podcast. The bottom line with this is that you need to be in as many places as possible. Get out there so people can find you and make it easy for them to listen and subscribe to your show on their preferred listening channel. If you found even the smallest little nugget of wisdom in this episode, share it with a friend that needs to hear it. Don't be stingy. They will think that you're an absolute rock star. I love it when I get a random text from a friend with a link to a podcast and an OMG, you've got to listen to this. That is how I discover new shows. I don't find them by looking at iTunes rankings. And Instagram is my jam. You can connect with me there to get the behind the scenes of where my podcasting and musical worlds collide. I love doing Instagram stories. Check them out. And for my podcasting tutorials, subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find me on YouTube at Jen Eads Brassy. Thanks for listening. Now get out in the world and do some good.